Hey there. When it comes to teaching English as an additional language, Thailand has a really interesting thing going on.
Hmm.
Over 90% of primary students in EMI schools are learning English as an additional language.
That's right. And for those who might not know,
Yeah.
EMI schools are those that teach most of their curriculum in English. So
Wow.
we're talking about a huge number of kids who are not only learning a new language, but learning almost everything in that new
It's
language.
like being thrown into the deep end, but in a good way.
Right.
Like you have to swim to learn.
Exactly.
And we want to make sure those students and the incredible teachers working with them have the best support possible.
Yeah.
That's why this deep dive is all about adapting those global best practices in EL education to the unique cultural context of Thailand.
Exactly. And we've got some great sources to work with today.
Okay.
Excerpts from a recent master's thesis that really dug deep into this, plus some cutting-edge research on ELL teaching methods.
Okay. So let's dive into the first big idea, translanguaging. Now, I'll admit, when I first heard that term, I thought it was just a fancy way of saying translation. But it's so much bigger than that.
It really is. See, for a long time, there was this idea that bilingualism was a problem to be solved in the classroom. Like students had to somehow shut off their first language to learn English effectively. Translanguaging challenges that entire idea.
So instead of seeing a student's native language as a detriment, you actually leverage it.
Exactly. It's about recognizing that for these students, especially in EMI schools where they're learning everything in English, their first language is their strongest tool. It's how they make sense of the world.
So how does this actually play out in a classroom? Give me an example.
Let's say you're teaching a lesson about the solar system.
Okay.
With translanguaging, you might have students discuss their understanding of the planets in Thai first. Then they could use a bilingual dictionary or online resources to find the English terms, gradually building those connections between languages.
I see. So they're not just memorizing vocabulary in isolation. They're actually using their existing knowledge to make those words meaningful.
Exactly. And there's research to back this up.
Oh, really?
A study by David in 2017 found that when students worked together to translate texts, even simple ones, they ended up having these amazing language problem-solving events. They'd debate the best words to use, clarify concepts in both languages. Those moments were like learning gold.
Okay, I have to admit, I'm starting to see how powerful this could be.
Yeah.
Imagine a classroom where a student can ask a question in Thai, get part of the answer in English, and then have a classmate jump in and clarify something in Thai again. It's like they're building a bridge to understanding together using all their linguistic tools.
That's exactly it. And that's the beauty of translanguaging. It's not about replacing English. It's about creating a more inclusive and effective learning environment by valuing all the language resources students bring to the table.
That makes a lot of sense. So we've laid the groundwork with translanguaging, creating that space where students feel comfortable using both Thai and English. But how do we then make sure they gain the confidence to really use those developing English skills?
That's where oracy comes in.
Yeah.
And no, it's not just a fancy way of saying speaking.
Okay, good to know. I was about to say.
Yeah.
So what makes oracy different?
It's about going beyond simply knowing the words to actually being able to use them fluently and confidently in real-time conversations. Think about it. You can have a student who aces a vocabulary quiz but clams up in a group discussion. Oracy is about equipping them with the tools to not just understand English, but to actively participate in it.
So it's like the difference between studying a map and actually navigating a city.
Yeah.
You need both to really get where you're going.
Exactly. And there's a framework called Oracy 21 that breaks this down beautifully.
Oh, wow.
It identifies 4 key dimensions to oracy:
Oh,
physical, linguistic, cognitive, and social emotional.
wow. Okay, there's a lot to unpack there. So it's not just about pronunciation or grammar.
Not at all physical. Includes things like using your voice effectively, body language, all those nonverbal cues that play a big part in communication. Linguistic is your vocabulary and grammar, of course, but also things like knowing how to structure different types of sentences for different purposes.
Like having all the tools in your toolkit, but also knowing which one to use for the job.
Exactly. And then you've got the cognitive dimension.
Okay.
How you organize your thoughts, summarize information, use logic and reasoning in a conversation.
That makes sense. You could have perfect grammar, but if you can't follow a line of reasoning or explain your thinking, you're not going to be a very effective communicator.
Right. And finally, there's the social and emotional side.
Okay.
Things like reading social cues, understanding different perspectives, and managing your own emotions in a conversation. That's especially important in a Thai context where communication styles can be quite different.
I could see that.
Yeah.
So how do we actually teach oracy in a way that takes all of this into account, especially those cultural nuances?
One highly effective strategy, and it ties in beautifully with translanguaging, is dialogic teaching.
Okay.
This isn't about drilling vocabulary or grammar rules. It's about turning the classroom into a space for genuine discussion and debate.
Uh-huh.
Picture a Thai classroom buzzing with small group discussions where students use both Thai and English to unpack a complex English text together. That's the power of dialogic teaching in action.
Okay, I'm getting a picture of this now, and I like it. It sounds a lot more engaging than just listening to a lecture, but does it actually work?
The research is phenomenal. A researcher named John Hattie did this huge meta-analysis of different teaching strategies back in 2009. He looked at hundreds of studies, and you know what he found?
What's that?
Dialogic teaching had the single biggest positive impact on student achievement out of every strategy he looked at.
That's huge.
Hmm.
It sounds like dialogic teaching could be a real game changer, especially for ELL students. But I imagine it takes some real skill to make it work, especially in a Thai context where respect for teachers and avoiding confrontation are so important.
You're right. Cultural sensitivity is key. Imagine a student who understands a concept but is hesitant to speak up in front of the whole class. We might misinterpret that silence as a lack of understanding when really it's rooted in kreng, this deep consideration for others that's so important in Thai culture.
That makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
So how do we adapt dialogic teaching to honor those values?
Well, for starters, group work,
Okay.
already common in Thai classrooms,
Right.
becomes even more valuable. It allows students to practice their English and test out new ideas in a lower stakes setting. Plus, it plays into that Thai emphasis on collaboration.
So it's about creating a space where mistakes are seen as part of the learning process, not something to be ashamed of.
Exactly. And when it comes to giving individual feedback, a teacher might choose to have a quiet one-on-one conversation with a student rather than pointing out errors in front of the whole class. It's about respecting that concept of saving face.
It's about building trust so those students feel safe taking risks in their learning.
Right, and don't underestimate the power of a little sanuk, that sense of fun and playfulness that's so central to Thai culture.
Okay, I love that. So instead of a rigid textbook-driven lesson, you might bring in some humor, maybe tell a personal story related to the topic, or even incorporate games to create a more relaxed learning environment.
Exactly.
Hmm.
It can do wonders for putting students at ease and fostering that crucial teacher-student connection. It can also make it more acceptable for students to ask questions, which can sometimes be a challenge when there's a strong emphasis on respect for the teacher's knowledge.
So we've talked about translanguaging to create that inclusive language environment and dialogic teaching to build fluency and confidence. But we also know you need a strong foundation of vocabulary to really thrive in English.
Absolutely. And that's where tiered vocabulary comes in. It's a way of approaching vocabulary instruction that recognizes not all words are created equal.
All right, break it down for me.
Picture a pyramid. At the bottom, you have your tier 1 words, everyday words that most kids pick up naturally, like house, eat, play. Then you have your tier 2 words, which are still high-frequency words but show up more in written texts and academic contexts. Words like analyze, compare, conclude. These are the words that can really trip up EL learners, even if their conversational English seems pretty strong.
I can see how that would be true,
Okay.
especially for students in those EMI schools who are learning everything in English.
Exactly. And then at the very top of the pyramid, you have your tier 3 words, your subject-specific jargon like photosynthesis in science or democracy in social studies. Now, here's where things get interesting for EL learners. Even some tier 1 words might need explicit instruction, especially if they have different connotations or cultural baggage in the student's first language.
So it's not just about the word itself, but about making sure students understand its meaning within a specific cultural context.
Precisely. And that's where teaching vocabulary in the student's first language can be incredibly powerful. Let's say you're teaching a group of Thai students the English word brave. You might start by discussing the concept of bravery in Thai, maybe even sharing a traditional Thai story about a brave hero. This helps students connect the English word to something they already understand, making it much more likely they'll remember it.
It's like building a bridge between languages. So you might have students create their own bilingual dictionaries, brainstorm synonyms in both Thai and English, or even act out vocabulary words, anything that helps make those connections stick.
Exactly. And the research on this is compelling. Beck McCune and Kukan, in their work on tiered vocabulary, found that even just explaining those basic tier 1 words in a student's first language can make a huge difference in their overall language development.
It's amazing how these strategies all work together, isn't it? You create that inclusive environment with translanguaging, you encourage real communication through dialogic teaching, and then you build that strong vocabulary foundation, always keeping the Thai cultural context in mind.
It's all connected, and that's why it's so important for educators to be reflective practitioners. It's not enough to just know the what of good EL instruction. We need the how
Right.
that's sensitive to cultural
It's
nuances.
like having all the best ingredients for a delicious meal, but you need that perfect blend of spices and seasonings to make those flavors really sing, right?
That's a great way to put it. We're not talking about throwing out best practices from global EL research, but rather filtering them through a lens of Thai cultural understanding.
It's about finding that global solution.
Hmm.
And sometimes that takes a bit of trial and error, right?
Absolutely. Observe your students, listen to their needs, and don't be afraid to ask for their feedback directly. Those students are your greatest resource.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into EL education in Thailand, what's one key takeaway you hope our listeners will walk away with today?
That's easy. Remember that teaching is not a neutral act. We're always bringing our own experiences and biases into the classroom. And when we're talking about ELL instruction, where we're often taking teaching methods developed in one cultural context and applying them in another, it's our responsibility to really examine those methods, to consider the power structures they might embody, and to ask ourselves honestly, whose voices are being privileged here? Whose voices might be getting
It's
lost?
about constantly questioning our assumptions and staying open to new ways of thinking.
Exactly. And never underestimate the power of those aha moments, those moments when a student teaches you something new about their language, their culture, their way of seeing the world.
That's what makes teaching such a rewarding profession. So to all our listeners out there, keep asking those tough questions, keep adapting those teaching toolkits, and never stop learning from the incredible ELS students you work with every day. Until next time on The Deep Dive.